This is the Canon RF 50mm f1.8 STM, also known as the Nifty 50, and this is the new-ish Canon 50mm f1.4 VCM. The 1.8 is just about everybody's starter prime lens. It's small, it's light, and it's crazy affordable. That said, the 1.4 L is undeniably the better lens. The question is it worth almost 7 times the price? Right off the bat, these two lenses feel really different. The 50mm f1.8 weighs only 160 grams. It's super small, super light, but honestly, it doesn't really feel super cheap, and I think it's a noticeable step up in build quality from its EF mount predecessor. It's got an all-metal lens mount on the back and a control ring at the very front. The only thing that's really disappointing about it, in my opinion, is that the single switch on the lens changes the operation of this control ring from a focus control ring to a programmable ring that you can use to change other settings like ISO. On the surface, this sounds kind of neat, but it actually means that to switch from manual focus to autofocus or autofocus to manual focus, you actually have to do so on the main camera body instead of just flipping a switch on the lens. And that can be a real pain in the butt. The 1.4 VCM is about 3 times the size of the 1.8, but it's still not terribly large or heavy in the grand scheme of things, weighing in at 390 grams. With this one, you get weather sealing, dedicated control and focus rings, a proper autofocus and manual focus switch, a focus hold button, and a dedicated iris control ring, which unfortunately only works in video mode, but it's still pretty cool. The VCM definitely feels like a much more professional lens, but the small size of the STM also has some benefits, so it really kind of just comes down to what you need. But that is just the outside, and as indicated by the massive size difference, there's some real differences on the inside of these two lenses. The f1.8 uses Canon's classic STM motor, which is small, pretty fast, and fairly smooth. It is kinda noisy though. In stills mode, it'll also kinda hunt for focus every once in a while, especially if you're shooting in low light. The f1.4 has Canon's new VCM tech, or voice coil motor, and a nano USM, which I'm not even gonna pretend to understand what any of that really means. All I know is that it's faster, it's smoother, and it's insanely quiet. Take a listen to the 1.4 compared to the 1.8. I also noticed that the VCM tends to perform better in low light with less focus hunting. I don't like to pixel peep too much just because there are other people that do it way better than I can, and I also just don't really care unless I notice a lens's deficiency outside of the lab. So let me show you what I actually noticed after going out and using these two lenses in the field. The f1.4 is an insanely sharp lens. It's one of the sharpest I've ever seen. This was shot at 1.4, and you can tell even just right here, this B, it's tack sharp, even zooming in quite far. It's definitely sharper than the f1.8. I've got a comparison photo here. This one was shot on the 1.8 STM. Here I'll zoom in on it and we'll compare it to the VCM. That's the VCM right there. And back to the STM. It's a very slight difference with the sharpness here in the center. Now let's take a look at the sharpness on the edges, because that makes a big difference here too. This image was shot on the STM, and we'll zoom in over on the right hand corner here. You can tell it's like not super sharp, definitely not as sharp as if we were focusing on over on the center, but I've got the focus over here in the corner of the frame, and I'll switch over to the VCM. Let that load, and you can tell the VCM is definitely quite a bit sharper on the edges than the STM. So there's the VCM and the STM. VCM, STM. So it retains a lot of that sharpness across the entire image when compared to the STM. One thing that the 1.4 really has going for it is just that extra stop of light and the bokeh. So this image was shot on the 1.4 at 1.4, and you get that nice dreamy foreground here in front of the painter. This shot right here is on the STM 1.8. And again, I mean, it looks pretty dang good. You know, the focus is nailed right on my face, and the background is pretty dang blurred. It's at f1.8. This is the VCM. So here's the VCM, and back to the STM. VCM, STM, and back to the VCM. The VCM has just a much smoother, more blurred out, and kind of like creamy, dreamy background. You've got this bokeh in the trees. Comparing the VCM to the STM up here, you can see how much more shape the STM has. Those are much more circular bokeh lines, where when I flip back over to the VCM, you get more of an oval, and it's just much more blurred out, much more dreamy. To each their own. I like the 1.4 better, and I'll tell you why. Because if we switch back to the VCM or the STM here, the 1.8, you can see these bokeh lines over to my left. There's just like these little tiny lines in the foliage here. At 1.4, you'll see all of those lines go away. Everything is smoothed over. I think that just has to do with the extra stop of light and the optical clarity of the VCM over the STM. So keep an eye on that. As I zoom out, you'll actually be able to see a huge difference, and why the VCM, in my opinion, is a much better lens optically. Here's the STM at 1.8, and here is the VCM at 1.4. Let me know which one you prefer down below. It's just kind of different styles, but one of the optical quality things that makes a huge difference is the chromatic aberration and how it handles lens flaring. So I did a couple sample photos here just of this pine tree, just to kind of get a feel and test it, push it to its limits with that super bright background. This is the 1.8, the cheap lens, and you can see right in the middle here, you've got a decent amount of chromatic aberration on these branches. It's not horrible, and there's ways to get rid of this in editing software, but straight out of the lens with no corrections whatsoever, this is what the STM looks like. Now, if I just switch that over to the VCM, you'll see a lot of that color goes away. It's not nearly as purple. There is still a little bit of color shift and a little bit of fringing here, but nothing compared to the 1.8. So again, this is the 1.4, and I'll flip right over to the 1.8, which definitely, there's a lot more chromatic aberration in there. And that's just the center of the lens, which you should have the least amount of chromatic aberration in. So I have another photo here to test the edges of the lens. This one right here is the STM. And if you zoom in over on these leaves, you can see there's a little bit of like ghosting around the edges of the leaves. This is all just flaring, and there's some aberration up here in the pine needles. And if I switch that over to the VCM, you'll see a lot of that goes away, and it's a lot sharper. Here's the 1.8 again with the flaring and the chromatic aberration over on the edge of the screen, and flip back to the more expensive VCM. All of that goes away. Check out the shadows over here on the left side. This is the cheap 1.8 lens, and this is the more expensive 1.4 lens. Both of these shots are done at the same shutter speed, the same aperture, the same ISO. You can see right up on the upper right of the screen here. The only difference is the lens. And that VCM just carries a lot more detail and a lot more sharpness than we're seeing on the STM. The STM doesn't look terrible, but if you're going for professional results, I'd have to choose the VCM. As far as video goes, both lenses perform pretty well, but the VCM definitely caters more toward the hybrid creator. I mean, that's why they made this thing in the first place. Obviously, you have all of the benefits of the better and almost dead silent VCM autofocus, plus the optical quality improvements, but there's also much less focus breathing when compared to the 1.8, which really matters when it comes to video and doing focus pulls. On the body of the VCM, the control, focus, and iris rings are much more optimized for video than the single front ring of the 1.8, and the focused hold button on the side can override your autofocus settings and keep you locked on your current subject, which is really nice for shooting B-roll, especially if you're trying to like go around something or do a reveal around a wall or a tree. Now you can bind this same function to any of your camera's customizable buttons, but I just find it much more convenient to have it on the actual lens itself when you're shooting, and to have that extra button so that I can bind other stuff to the camera. It is nice to see Canon finally catching up to Sony in this regard, because they've been doing this for years. Finally, the extra stop of light from the f1.4 aperture when compared to the f1.8 does help a good amount in darker scenes. I wouldn't call it like a night and day difference, but if you shoot weddings or other indoor events, it's going to give you that sort of like extra headroom that's really nice, especially when you're shooting in video mode that doesn't have as much flexibility when it comes to the raw files. So the 1.4 is obviously the better lens, but here's the part that hurts. The little RF 50mm f1.8 only costs about $220, which in today's market is fairly reasonable for as good of a lens as this is. On the other hand, the f1.4 VCM comes in at $1,500, which is just insane. So is the VCM almost 7 times better than the STM? Well, I would say no, but it's not really that simple. If you're a hobbyist or you're on a budget, then I would go with the f1.8. It's a great camera that's going to give you amazing images, all for a really affordable price. But if you're a professional hybrid shooter who does things for a living, like shooting weddings or anything that requires like that level of professional touch to your equipment, I would 100% recommend going with the 1.4 VCM. I think the 1.4 is definitely a worthy investment simply because 50mm is so versatile, it'll probably live on your camera a lot of the time, and it's worth getting one that's gonna be as enjoyable to use and as optically beautiful as this lens. Let me know down below which prime you're gonna be picking up, but if you're more interested in zoom lenses, you should check out this video over here where I review Canon's best zoom lens overall and see what I think about it, because that might be a good investment for you as well.